Most people have heard of the doctrine of the imago Dei, or the idea of bearing God's image as a created human, but most people probably haven't reflected on it that deeply or thought about the implications of what that means for kind of all areas of life and human existence. Well, Carmen Imes has, and she has a lot of helpful thoughts about it in this book, Being God's Image. Let me tell you what I thought about it. Welcome to Books and Big Ideas, what I'm reading, what I'm thinking about, with Joel Wentz. Okay, I have here a copy of Carmen Imes' new book, Being God's Image, from IVP Academic. Thank you again to IVP for sending me a copy for review. I'm going to take you through my typical format of the main idea, the research, the readability, and then my reaction to the book. Okay, the main idea of Being God's Image is kind of what Carmen Imes seems to be doing with these book projects. I also just posted a review of her previous work, Bearing God's Name. What she seems to be doing with these book projects is taking an isolated doctrine from the scriptures, exploring where that doctrine comes from, and then tracing its theme through the biblical narrative, and also some, like in this book in particular, some applications to kind of our understandings of it, of how that doctrine plays out in our life and our existence today, in modern day. Through the Old and the New Testaments. She is very, very strong on the continuity between the Old and New Testaments and the continuous biblical story there. And so that's kind of what she seems to be, her project seems to be in these pieces of work. And in this one in particular, she takes the doctrine of the imago Dei, the image of God, in which humans are created in Genesis 1. And very importantly, and this is the kind of the main thing I want to emphasize about her main idea in this book, and I really liked this, she, just like in Bearing God's Name, she makes an important linguistic semantic nuance between what does the word bear mean, to bear. Here she makes a pretty assertive claim that we should not talk about bearing God's image, rather we should talk about being God's image, hence the title of the book. Like, it is something that all humans are by virtue of being created, by, to use a philosophical term, their contingency, by existing, and nothing else. There's no other qualifications to it. We are God's image in the world. She makes that very, very clear, and it creates this really helpful starting point, kind of like keystone to the rest of the book. And then she traces out where that comes from, how she kind of argues that from the scriptures and how it touches the rest of the biblical narrative, which is interesting because, as she talks about in the opening pages of the book, it doesn't, like, the language of imago Dei, the language of bearing God's image. I just said bearing, because that's just so ingrained in us. The language of God's image in humanity is not frequently noted explicitly in the text, in the biblical text. It's not, and she talks about that, but nevertheless she talks about how it lurks behind so much of what flows out of the Old Testament story, and then ultimately the New Testament ministry of Jesus, and then the ministry of the early church, and on into today. And importantly, she touches on current day experiences. She talks about suffering quite a bit. She talks about what is the implications of the doctrine of the imago Dei on our understanding of things like ability and disability. Very, very, and gender. Gender is a big aspect too that she talks about. Male and female, equally having God's image. So that's kind of just a little bit of a taste of where she goes with, after tracing out the doctrine and then kind of through the Bible and then into our kind of modern day life. So that's what the book is about. The research, I feel like I'm going to be a little bit of a broken record if you watch my other review of Bearing God's Name. This is Being God's Image. That's a hard thing to keep in mind when I'm reviewing both of them back to back. But the research here is, she's a great scholar. She's done the heavy work. This is IVP Academic again, and it's under that label, not because it's a hard book to read at all. Quite the opposite. It's extremely easy to read, but I think it's under that label because of the scholarly kind of work behind it and the scholarly heft that she brings to the project. So she's very conversant in, from what I can tell, up-to-date scholarly conversations about the biblical text and text criticism, but also applications. She talks about in this book about how she did a lot of reading on theology of disability to prepare herself for this project in particular, and you can tell she's done some like serious research behind the book, behind the work, and it's all cited. And just like in her first book, what I loved so much, she does a deeper dive section at the end of each chapter on certain themes from that chapter. If you want to read more, here are a few accessible and more academic, deeper works you can read on your own. And so, again, especially these entry-level books like this one, I love when they do that, because it gives you kind of this curated reading list of stuff that you can do a deeper dive in on your own. It also provides a nice kind of resource after each chapter that you can refresh yourself on as when you pull the book down from the shelf. So that's the research behind it. It is really good. The readability, I've already tipped my hand a little bit to this, but if you read her first book, this is very much in the same level of style. It's so easy to read, full of anecdotes, full of like really winsome examples and analogies and stories from her life. It's just extremely accessible. There's like no barrier to entry here. And this, just like Bearing God's Name, I could give this to basically anybody. Maybe not a tiny little kid, but I give this to basically anybody in my church, and I have high confidence they could read it and understand it and be encouraged and challenged by it and provoked some thoughts. So again, like her, she pairs this deep research with an incredibly winsome, inviting style of writing in a way that probably a lot of academics probably struggle with. So huge commendation there on the readability. Again, now that I've read both these books right back to back, I'm expecting that more of Carmen Imes' work is going to be similarly extremely accessible. I think that's going to be her lane, and I'm really glad that she's in that. It's a wonderful thing. Okay, now finally my reaction to this book. Of her two books, I'm reviewing both of them. This is my Carmen Imes day on my channel, I guess. I've read them both very closely back to back and reviewing them both at the same time. Of the two, I liked them both quite a bit, and I liked this one even more, I think. I like this one even more. Again, like them both, but this one is probably my favorite of the two if I had to pick. I really appreciated, I think what I appreciated so much about it is the way that she is conversant with modern day issues when it comes to gender and disability in particular. Her writing on that, and she's entering the conversation as a woman, of course, and so she just brings her perspective into that in a very helpful, thoughtful, thought-provoking, encouraging, edifying, challenging way it just really landed in a great way with me in particular. I think that she succeeds really well in taking this, what could be an esoteric, abstract doctrine, the image of God, which is also potentially overly familiar to people in a way. It could be overly familiar to people because it's so easily talked about, and we even take for granted things like human dignity and human value in our ethics in the West, or at least we pay lip service to them. We talk about them a lot, but she really dives into the biblical basis for it, historical basis for it, how that doctrine has been treated over time, and then also, like I said, really importantly, how it touches on pressing issues in our day. And I just find that she did it really thoughtfully, really winsomely, really helpfully, without sacrificing any of the scholarly heft that's behind it. And so I actually, I really appreciate both books, and I really appreciate this one. Now, some of the same caveats, if you watch my review of Bearing God's Name, some of the same thing applies in my reaction there. I would say this is more geared towards an introductory text for someone who hasn't done a lot of deep dives into the biblical theology movement, or kind of the canonical approach, the continuity, continuous approach to interpreting the New and Old Testaments. Someone who hasn't done a lot of deep diving into that would benefit immensely from this book, more so than someone who has done a good bit. So, for example, Richard Middleton wrote the foreword of this book, and I have already read a lot of his stuff, including his work on the image of God, which is quite a bit more academic. And so in a way, I could see it flowing the other way, where someone reads Carmen Imes' book first and then sees, oh, Richard Middleton, he seems like someone who's really thought about this. I'm going to go read his next because it's a bit of a deeper dive, whereas I kind of went the other way. Depending on who you are, depending on your level of reading that you've done, depending on how much time you have to read, depending on how much energy you have to read, like if you're lower on the time and energy scale but still interested in the stuff, Carmen Imes, go to Carmen Imes, read her books. They're so great for that person particularly. If you're someone who's done a lot more of the reading, maybe like me, it might still be really valuable to have on your shelf because of that resource aspect to it, and because it is such a quick and easy thing to review yourself. But it may not be the thing that drives you to a lot of new conclusions, per se. So very similar reaction to kind of both books. I'm so glad that she's writing. I'm so glad she's putting these things out. I'm so glad that she's a great representative of the biblical theology move that I am such a big fan of. That's given me a lot of just a lot to chew on over the years, and injected a lot of life into my own understanding of sacred text. So really appreciate both these books. Especially really did appreciate Being God's Image and some of her core ideas there that she so effectively traces out and applies to modern life. So those are my thoughts on Being God's Image by Carmen Imes. As always, thank you for watching.